Since its creation just over 80 years ago, we've always known that there's a problem with GDP. But I think in the last 10 years, there's been a growing awareness and a growing recognition across different sectors that something has to change. That change has come because of the growing awareness that our planet is running up against its environmental limits, particularly climate change. It's also come with events like the Arab Spring, where we saw that countries that were supposed to be economic superstars like Tunisia were in fact societies that were crumbling from within. We also have urgency because of the growing sense that economic growth has left too many people behind. There's a lack of inclusive growth. And so I feel as if we've hit a moment when the world is ready to start thinking about how we measure the progress of our societies. And the Social Progress Index is a contribution to that debate. There's not just an intellectual debate, it's a critical debate about how we make the choices about the future of our societies. So let me be a definition to begin with. The Social Progress Index has been designed as a complement to GDP, not as a replacement. So the idea is that it works as a complementary measure to sit alongside GDP to help governments and societies make better decisions. That's the fundamental idea behind the Social Progress Index. The group behind the Social Progress Index is my organization, Social Progress Imperative, which is a US non-profit organization. And I just want to show you who we have on our advisory board. I normally keep this slide in the deck for presentations in America, because when you say Social Progress Index in America, they often think you must be a terrible group of socialists. And actually, as I always say to them, look, the chairman of our advisory board is Professor Michael Porter from Harvard Business School, the world's most cited economist and business academic, a registered Republican, the guru on competitiveness and strategy. If this is a socialist, I am a pumpkin. So we've got this is very much a group that is people who understand business, understand the importance of business and economic development, but also recognize it's not enough. This is not about being business against society. This is about figuring how business and society can work together to achieve better outcomes for everyone. That's the purpose. So the Social Progress Index has 4 key design principles. The first one is it's only based on social and environmental indicators. This is a key distinction. There are other measures such as the Human Development Index produced by the UN, the OECD Better Life Index. What these measures do is they all mix up the economic and the social. They mix up GDP and other economic measures with social and sometimes environmental measures. What we've done with the Social Progress Index is separated them, not because the economic doesn't matter, but by creating an independent, robust measure of social progress, we can then look at the relationship between economic development and social progress independently. So that's the first key design principle. Secondly, all our measures are based on outcomes. We're not measuring what laws are passed, how much money is spent. We're not measuring inputs. We're measuring what societies achieve. And that means we don't have to make value judgments about which are the right policies or laws. We're just saying, measure the outcomes. The third thing we wanted to do with the Social Progress Index was make it relevant to all countries. I think sometimes we look at the world with this sort of what I call a data apartheid, that we look at developed countries in one lens and developing countries with others. But that's not what our world is like. Our world is coming together. There are overlapping challenges across levels of development. The world's not that two north and south world anymore. So creating an index that would be relevant across all countries was critical. And then finally, actionability. The group that came together to produce the Social Progress Index were not academics. It was people involved in philanthropic foundations, businesses such as Deloitte, social entrepreneurs, people who wanted to drive change in the world. So actionability was a key feature of the way we designed the Social Progress Index. So that's the design principles. All we had to do next was define what social progress means. Now, Aristotle had to go more than 2,000 years ago, and so I will not say that we have solved the problem. But what I think we have done is come up with a reasonably robust and defensible definition of social progress, and this is it. So what we are saying is that social progress is about, first of all, a society where everyone has the basic needs of survival: food, water, shelter, safety. Secondly, a good society is one where everyone has access to the building blocks of a better life: education, information, health, and a good quality environment. And finally, a good society is one where every citizen has the opportunity to pursue their hopes and dreams with rights, freedom of choice, freedom from discrimination, and access to the world's most advanced knowledge. These 12, what we call components, make up the Social Progress Index model. This definition comes from an extensive literature. In particular, in 2009, there was a big report called Mismeasuring Our Lives, written by Amartya Sen, Joseph Stiglitz, and Jean-Paul Fitoussi. And that was a kind of a landmark report that really laid out the landscape on this. So we're both building on that kind of report. Also building on UN commitments, UN Declaration of Human Rights, but also very much a strong alignment with the new UN Sustainable Development Goals. We've taken this out, we've tested it, we've talked to economists, political scientists, philosophers, people in pubs, and what's come back is this is a pretty reasonable definition of what makes social progress. So having defined social progress, all we have to do then is measure it. And what we've done with the Social Progress Index is we don't gather any new data. We've gone out and looked at what data we can find in the world produced from reliable and credible sources. So here's our model for the Social Progress Index. So for each of these 12 components of social progress, we've found somewhere between 3 and 6 indicators to measure each of these concepts. If you want to see a man cry, ask me about data. Yeah? The data can always get better. Yeah? We will never say this is perfect. What we do say is we think we've got good enough data to come up with some robust and credible results. There are lots of areas in which we'd love to see better data, and one of our mandates is actually campaigning to improve the data we have to measure our societies. So that's our model. It's 3 to 6 indicators to measure each component. That creates a score for the component. We then aggregate those up and produce a Social Progress Index score. The data comes principally from UN agencies, but we also take some data from expert opinions, especially on human rights issues. And then also some data comes from surveys, particularly from Gallup. And that's critical data because that measures people's real lived experience. So it's an important element in the model. So more than 50 different indicators. We add those up and we produce a score. And we produce a score for each country on a scale of 0 to 100, and we can then rank countries. Now, some people don't like the idea of ranking countries. And some people, statisticians in particular, don't like the idea of creating composite indices where you add together different measures. For us, this was critical. I think what we know about our world is that the only way you get people interested in numbers like data like this is if there is a single number that goes up and down. Yeah? GDP goes up and down. Inflation goes up and down. The stock market goes up and down. To get real attention, you've got to have that communicability. Dashboards do not work. Dashboards will not capture that public attention. So it's a very clear point for us that you had to be able to aggregate to a single number, and you had to create a ranking to drive some of the interest and some of the competition. Critical also to have the underlying data, and I'll talk about that later, that you can then understand those numbers, but having a single point was critical. So here is now our global ranking. And the country in the world with the highest social progress is, in fact, Finland. It's always a bit disappointing when the Scandinavians come top. Sometimes it's kind of a lose-lose situation. If it's not the Scandinavians, everyone says you're wrong. If it is the Scandinavians, everyone says it's boring. So let me try and give you my best attempt to show that it's both not unsurprising and interesting. Because what we've found is there are 12 countries at the top that have clustered together with very high social progress. That includes Finland, it includes the Nordic countries. But what strikes me about this result is it's not just the Nordics. We've got Canada, the UK, Ireland, Netherlands, Australia, New Zealand in that group. So it's not just about the Nordic model is the only path to very high social progress. There actually are other models out there, which I think is quite an important finding. So that's our top 12 countries that have very high social progress. We then have a large second group of high social progress countries, and you may have noticed that at 21st there's a country called Portugal. So Portugal is in the high social progress category. That's in with Germany, France, United States, Italy, etc. Portugal at 21st, so a couple of places below the United States, and then a few places above Italy, and then you'll find sort of Poland, Slovakia, Greece somewhat lower. Above, somewhere behind Ireland, a little bit behind Spain, a little bit behind France. Quite tight there, though. So you'll have to tell me whether you think that's a good or a bad result for Portugal. But, high social progress, and in general, the EU countries do pretty well. You've got Bulgaria, Romania lagging a bit behind at 42nd, 43rd. But generally, the EU is quite coherent. And certainly, if we look at this data, one of the big underperformers on this data is the United States. United States coming in at 19th, just beating Slovenia. Given the wealth of the United States, quite a remarkably poor result. Now, we can look at the data another way, and what I've done here is plotted social progress on the vertical axis, GDP per capita on the horizontal axis. And it's got no GDP in the model, this is just for illustration. And what this demonstrates is a thing the Social Progress Index can do, which is to show how do countries perform relative to their GDP. Because we've separated out the economic and social, so the social and environmental from the economic, we can do this. And what this demonstrates is, first of all, getting more GDP is in general good for social progress. I mean, that is the headline finding, yeah? And that kind of makes sense, yeah? As countries, societies get more GDP, they've got more money to spend on roads and nurses and teachers and water supply. So getting economic growth is not a bad thing. What we also see is two other things. First of all, the way this curve flattens out. So as you get richer, each extra dollar of GDP is buying you less and less social progress. In a sense, for the poorer countries, there are easy wins from GDP. Get a bit more GDP, you can get quick progress on water and sanitation. As you get richer, it's not those easy wins have disappeared. You also find new problems with wealth. You find that perhaps you get to see obesity emerging. Your environmental quality deteriorates. So that's why we see this curve, the rate of this curve slowing down. The final thing I'd mention here is that what this also shows, absolutely clearly, empirically, is that GDP is not destiny. Now, I think we've all intuited this in the past, that GDP is not the whole story. What Social Progress Index can do is demonstrate that empirically. And what this shows us is that if you are a country, a society, with a development plan that's just about economics, your plan is incomplete. That actually thinking through your social progress strategy is critical alongside getting more GDP. So let's have a look now at how Portugal is doing in some more detail. We'll hear a bit more in depth on this from Margarita, so this is not all you'll hear. But this is our scorecard for a country. A lot of detail here, so let me walk you through this. So what we've done here is we're comparing Portugal's performance on social progress to a peer group of 15 countries of similar GDP per capita. So for every country, we create a scorecard like this on a consistent basis where we're comparing to the 15 countries closest in GDP per capita. The countries are listed here at the bottom, too small to read, I fear. Slovakia, Estonia, Greece, Slovenia, Lithuania, Czech Republic, Russia, Poland, Malaysia, Hungary, Kazakhstan, Israel, Cyprus, Chile, Latvia. Now, I recognise that these are not the countries that Portugal will normally benchmark itself against. But I think I just put this in here because it's a way of looking at the data and say, look, compared to countries of similar GDP, actually, Portugal is doing very well. And that's what we see here with this green flag at the top. The green flag says that relative to its GDP, Portugal is overperforming on its social progress. And that's actually very few developed countries actually achieve that. So Portugal is doing something right. We can then drill down and have a look and see what that is. And what we'll find is it's over here on the right-hand side, or on this what we call the opportunity dimension. And then we can drill down a bit further, and we can see it's around personal freedom and choice and tolerance and inclusion seem to be particular strengths for Portugal. Now, I very much welcome your feedback on whether this fits with your lived experience. But let me highlight why this is actually a really important finding for 3 reasons. The first of which is that actually tolerance and inclusion in particular is very hard to achieve. It's the area where the world performs almost the worst. Countries from low to high income struggle with tolerance and inclusion. The fact that Portugal, a country that's not monocultural and very small, the fact a diverse country like Portugal is doing well on tolerance and inclusion is actually a very good result, a very interesting result, and I think Portugal perhaps has something to teach the rest of the world. The second reason this matters is because in other analysis we've done, we've shown that this opportunity dimension seems to have a strong independent relationship with life satisfaction. So doing well on opportunity seems to be linked to people being happy. So that's good news. Good if you want to be happy. The third thing is maybe if you don't care about happiness, this also, other analysis that Deloitte have done, looking at foreign direct investment flows, show a very important relationship between tolerance and inclusion and investment flows, especially for high-income, highly developed economies. So if Portugal is seeking to attract high-quality foreign direct investment, tolerance and inclusion seems to be an important factor, which kind of makes sense. If you're trying to attract the best talent to a business, you want to have a society where people will want to live, and that's a strength. So this is good news for Portugal on a number of fronts, this strong performance and opportunity. I'll leave Margaret to talk a bit more about the results in more detail. Let me show you now what we've done to drill down a bit, which is that we've been working with the European Commission to create a social progress index, not for the countries of the EU, but for the regions of the EU, the 272 what they call NUTS2 regions of the EU. And to do that, we've used Eurostat data, we've customized the data, but addressing the same 12 issues. And what we find, very quickly, is that this is our social progress map of Europe. Again, the Nordics perform well, they do. And then we see this pattern around southeastern Europe, the worst, but then we've got the transition countries, then a mixed pattern across southern Europe. Very interesting how Italy, in particular, is very much underperforming, as we saw on the global index. For Portugal, I can't go through all the data for each of the regions of Portugal, but let me show you the scorecard for where we are now, for Lisbon. And this is less good news. So what's the story here? So first of all, remember, this is comparing Lisbon to 15 regions of the EU with similar GDP per capita. And they're listed at the bottom. Some of them are in Spain, some of them in the UK, a range of different regions being compared to. So regions with similar GDP per capita. And if you look at this, the issue is that Lisbon is 91st in the EU on GDP per capita, but only 173rd on social progress. And this is a general problem we see for capital cities. If I showed you London, it would be very similar. London has the highest GDP per capita in the EU, but social progress is only the same as the UK average. So often capital cities have this problem that social progress is behind GDP. I should say in one way this is a good thing, because what this is showing us is that although GDP may be generated within capital cities and certain metropolitan regions, those resources are being transferred to the rest of the country to help even out levels of social progress. And perhaps we'd be worried if we saw capital cities showing very high GDP, very high social progress, and other parts of the country showing low GDP and low social progress. So the fact that Lisbon's underperforming may be a good sign, but also identifies there are plenty of areas where things could be improved. Happy again, we can talk more about these results in later on. Let me just finish by talking a bit about how this data is practically used. The first of all, it's a tool for government. As I said, the European Social Progress Index has been a partnership with the European Commission, with DG Regio, because they wanted to create this data to really inform cohesion strategy for the EU, and not for both the European Commission, but also to support local regions with a new tool to help with investment planning, performance measurement, and benchmarking. So the European Commission really has been pushing the Social Progress Index as a practical tool to help cohesion policy, which is great. We've done a lot of work in Latin America since we started 3 or 4 years ago. Paraguay actually was the first country in the world to adopt a national development plan with both a GDP target and a social progress target. And so that's been hardwired into their national planning process, that's cascading through budgetary allocations, and is then the monitoring framework for a whole range of public investments. And personally, one of the things I'm very proudest about is the fact that we've therefore made some contribution to the Paraguayan government's commitment to reduce child malnutrition to less than 2% by 2018. And in a sense, trying to make sure that fewer kids go to bed hungry was why we created this. To have supported this goal of the Paraguayan government is something I'm very proud of. But then similarly across Latin America, we've got a range of work with state and city governments, Pará state in Brazil, with Bogotá. We're also working with Rio de Janeiro and other cities. So a whole range of partnerships with government using this data as an investment planning tool and a monitoring tool to really help think through development strategies. We've also done a lot of work with business. In Brazil, we've been partnering with Coca-Cola and Natura, and I may say a little bit about that just in a moment. We've also, in Costa Rica, started partnering with Cargill. Cargill have got some extensive agricultural operations there, particularly chicken farming. And they're very interested in measuring the social performance of the communities around where they have chicken farms. And so the Social Progress Index is being applied as a tool to measure community social progress to inform both Cargill and the local government's social investment strategies. I was very excited last week on Twitter when I heard that this group, Breckenridge Capital Advisors, based in Boston, a hedge fund based in Boston, is now using the Social Progress Index as part of its municipal bond fund analysis tool. So this, for us, this is very exciting. An investor is now using Social Progress Index data to try and understand where it should be investing. So they're looking at economic indicators, but now also social progress indicators in making investment decisions, which is very exciting. And then finally, we've done some work with Bayer, who've been thinking about their social responsibility, social innovation strategy, and they've been using Social Progress Index data to help guide and inform that. So that's just a few examples of how government and business have been using the Social Progress Index tool. I just want to finish with this case study from Coca-Cola and Natura. So this was a few years ago. We produced a Social Progress Index for municipalities of the Amazon region of Brazil. And Coca-Cola and Natura had critical supply chain in the Amazon forest. And they said, this data is very helpful for us, but we need more granular data. We want to understand the social progress of the communities where we have key supply chain issues to help us ensure that that supply chain is protected from depopulation, etc. So we work with Coca-Cola and Natura and produce a Social Progress Index for a specific community really in the middle of the Amazon in a municipality called Caruarí. And what that index demonstrated was that the needs of the people were not where the social investment was currently being targeted. And what that data has done is it's created a new collaboration between federal government, state government, local government, businesses such as Coca-Cola and Natura, as well as NGOs and other actors, to create a new consensus about the needs of those communities and a new program of social investments. And that, I think, is perhaps one of the great power we see in the Social Progress Index, to create a shared language around social progress. Too often the social sector is divided between the people working on education, people working on health, people working on human rights, people working on the environment, speaking different languages. By creating a common framework that can be understood across government, business, and civil society to take a holistic view about the needs of our societies, we hope that we can make better decisions, make better use of our capital, and ultimately improve people's lives. Thank you very much.